At the peak of his power, Al Capone was more than just a criminal, he was a symbol of fear, wealth, and control. In 1920s Chicago, his name alone was enough to silence enemies and command loyalty. He lived surrounded by luxury, expensive suits, private cars, fine dining, and constant protection. To the outside world, Capone appeared sharp-minded, confident, and unstoppable, a man fully in control of both his empire and himself. But behind this carefully maintained image, something invisible and dangerous had already begun its work. Years earlier, long before his rise to absolute power, Capone had contracted syphilis, a disease that, if left untreated, slowly attacks the nervous system and the brain. At the time, Capone either ignored the illness or chose not to treat it properly. Like many men of his era, he believed strength meant endurance, not medical care. This decision would later cost him everything. In the early stages, there were no obvious signs. Capone continued to expand his criminal network, making deals, eliminating rivals, and manipulating politicians and law enforcement. His mind was still sharp enough to run a complex empire, but deep inside, the disease was quietly progressing. It was patient. It did not rush. It waited. Gradually, small changes began to appear. Capone, once known for his remarkable memory, started forgetting details of meetings and conversations. He repeated questions he had already asked. Sometimes he would lose focus mid-discussion, staring into space as if his thoughts had suddenly vanished. Those around him noticed, but no one dared to mention it. In Capone's world, weakness was dangerous, and pointing it out could be fatal. His behavior also began to shift. The calm, calculating leader started showing sudden mood swings. At times he was generous, warm, and almost fatherly toward his associates. At other moments, he became aggressive, suspicious, and irrational. A simple disagreement could turn into a violent outburst. Paranoia slowly replaced trust. Capone began to believe that everyone was plotting against him, even those who had been loyal for years. He increased his security, changed locations constantly, and slept less. Nights became restless. His thoughts raced uncontrollably, while his judgment grew weaker. Physically, he still looked powerful. But mentally, cracks were forming. As the disease advanced, Capone's ability to think clearly began to deteriorate. He made impulsive decisions that contradicted his earlier strategies. He ignored warnings. He underestimated enemies. His once brilliant instincts started failing him, but his pride refused to accept it. Doctors at the time either did not fully understand the severity of neurosyphilis or were too intimidated to speak honestly. Capone himself refused to believe that anything was wrong with his mind. To him, admitting illness meant admitting vulnerability, something he had built his entire life avoiding. By the time the authorities finally managed to imprison him for tax evasion, Capone was no longer the man he once was. Prison did not just strip him of power and luxury, it exposed the reality he had been hiding from the world. Behind the bars, without influence, money, or control, his mental condition accelerated rapidly. Confusion increased. His memory worsened. He struggled to follow conversations. Simple tasks became difficult. The fearsome gangster who once ruled Chicago was slowly losing control over his own thoughts. When Al Capone entered prison, the world believed justice had finally won. Newspapers celebrated his arrest, politicians took credit, and the public saw it as the fall of a monster. But inside those cold prison walls, something far more tragic was unfolding, something no court sentence could ever undo. Prison stripped Capone of everything that once defined him. No bodyguards, no luxury, no whispered respect when he entered a room. For the first time in his life, he was just another inmate, a number, not a king. And without power to distract him, his illness began to dominate his reality. At first, Capone tried to maintain his authority. He walked with confidence, spoke loudly, and attempted to intimidate guards and prisoners alike. But it didn't take long for others to notice that something was deeply wrong. His speech sometimes became slow and unclear. He struggled to express complex thoughts. Conversations confused him, and he often misunderstood simple instructions. The disease that had quietly damaged his brain for years now accelerated in the harsh conditions of prison life. Capone began experiencing intense paranoia. He believed guards were plotting to poison him. He accused fellow inmates of spying on him. At night, he would pace his cell endlessly, talking to himself, replaying old conversations, arguing with people who were no longer there. Sleep became rare. His mind refused to rest. His memory deteriorated rapidly. He forgot names. He forgot dates. Sometimes, he forgot where he was. Guards reported moments where Capone seemed genuinely confused about whether he was in prison or back in Chicago running his empire. The past and present blurred into a single, broken timeline inside his mind. Emotionally, he became unstable. One moment he would laugh loudly at nothing, recalling old victories. The next, he would sit silently, staring at the wall for hours, lost in thoughts no one could reach. His famous confidence was slowly replaced by fear, not of enemies, but of his own collapsing mind. Medical examinations eventually confirmed the truth: Capone was suffering from advanced neurosyphilis. The disease had severely damaged his brain. His intelligence, once considered sharp and strategic, had dropped dramatically. Doctors noted that his mental capacity had declined to that of a child. This was not a man pretending. This was not manipulation. This was irreversible. Prison officials began treating him differently. Guards no longer saw him as a dangerous mastermind, but as a mentally broken man. He was assigned lighter duties, often excused from labor. Other inmates mocked him quietly, watching the once feared gangster struggle with basic tasks. The irony was cruel. Al Capone had escaped bullets, rival gangs, and assassins, but he could not escape his own untreated illness. Power, money, and fear had protected him from enemies, but none of them could protect him from his own body turning against him. As months passed, Capone's sense of identity continued to collapse. He spoke less about the future and more about imaginary plans that made no sense. He clung to memories that were no longer accurate, retelling stories that never happened or mixing reality with fantasy. The man who once controlled Chicago was now unable to control his own thoughts. As time passed, Al Capone's mind continued to slip further away from reality. The prison doctors documented a steady decline, but words on paper could never fully capture what was happening behind his eyes. The powerful criminal who once commanded absolute obedience was slowly disappearing, replaced by someone fragile, confused, and deeply lost. Capone began forgetting who people were, even those he had known for years. Familiar faces meant nothing to him. Sometimes, he introduced himself to guards who had supervised him for months, as if meeting them for the first time. At other moments, he spoke to them as if they were old friends from his Chicago days, giving orders that made no sense. His sense of time collapsed completely. Days felt like minutes. Years felt like hours. He asked repeatedly when he would be released, even after being told the same answer again and again. The concept of consequence no longer existed in his mind. The world had become fragmented, broken into disconnected moments he could not organize or understand. Capone's emotional state grew increasingly unstable. He laughed at memories that no longer aligned with reality. He cried without explanation. He became easily frightened by ordinary sounds: footsteps, doors closing, distant voices echoing through the corridors. Every noise felt like a threat, every shadow like an enemy. The prison staff, once cautious around him, now watched him with pity. He struggled with basic tasks that required focus and coordination. Writing became difficult. Reading exhausted him. Simple instructions confused him. His hands sometimes shook, his movements slowed, and his posture slouched, a visible reflection of the damage inside his brain. Worst of all, Capone slowly lost awareness of what he had become. He still believed he was powerful. He still spoke about future plans, about rebuilding his empire, about settling scores. But these plans were no longer grounded in reality. They were echoes of a life that no longer existed, fantasies created by a mind desperately clinging to its past. Doctors confirmed that the damage was permanent. No treatment could reverse it. The illness had destroyed key areas of his brain responsible for judgment, memory, and reasoning. The man known as Scarface was mentally gone, even though his body remained alive. This loss of identity was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Al Capone had built his life on control over people, money, fear, and power. Now, he had none. He could not even control his own thoughts. The empire he once ruled had vanished, and so had the man capable of ruling it. What remained was a shadow, a name without meaning, a legend trapped inside a broken mind. By the time Al Capone was released from prison, he was no longer considered a threat. The authorities did not fear his return to crime, because there was nothing left to return. The man walking out of prison was not the ruthless leader who once ruled Chicago. He was a mentally broken individual, confused, weakened, and far removed from the legend his name still carried. Capone was transferred to a hospital shortly after his release. Doctors monitored him closely, not as a criminal, but as a patient. Medical reports described severe cognitive decline. His ability to reason, remember, and communicate had deteriorated beyond recovery. Conversations were short and often meaningless. He struggled to follow simple questions. Long-term planning was impossible. Eventually, Capone was sent to his estate in Florida, where he lived under constant care. Surrounded by palm trees and quiet waters, the environment was peaceful, yet his mind remained a prison of its own. He wandered the house aimlessly, often forgetting where he was or why he was there. Familiar rooms felt foreign. Familiar people felt like strangers. His family watched helplessly as the man they once knew disappeared completely. Capone required assistance with daily activities. He was no longer capable of independent living. The powerful figure who once inspired fear now needed guidance to perform the simplest tasks. Occasionally, moments of clarity appeared. In rare flashes, Capone seemed aware of his condition. During these moments, sadness crossed his face, a brief recognition of everything he had lost. But these moments never lasted. Confusion always returned, swallowing awareness once again. His days became repetitive and empty. Long hours of silence, short, disjointed conversations, restless pacing. There were no plans, no ambitions, no future visions. The mind that once calculated complex criminal strategies had been reduced to fragments of memory and emotion. Al Capone was alive, but he was no longer truly living. The disease had taken more than his power, it had erased his identity. In his final years, Al Capone lived in near-total isolation from the world he once dominated. The newspapers no longer followed him. His enemies no longer feared him. His name, once spoken with terror, faded into history, remembered more as a legend than as a living man. His health continued to decline. The damage caused by neurosyphilis had spread too far, too deep. Capone's speech became increasingly unclear. His movements slowed. His awareness of the present weakened day by day. At times, he no longer recognized members of his own family. The past, once his source of pride, became a confused collection of broken images. Doctors observed that his mental capacity had deteriorated to that of a young child. He spent hours sitting silently, staring into nothing. Sometimes he laughed without reason. Sometimes he became frightened by harmless objects or sudden sounds. The world around him no longer made sense, and he lacked the ability to understand why. There was no dramatic ending. No final confrontation. No redemption. Al Capone died quietly in 1947, at the age of 48, not as a feared criminal, but as a man defeated by his own untreated illness. The empire he built collapsed long before his death. His power vanished. His influence ended. What remained was a cautionary story. His life became proof that no amount of money, fear, or control can protect a person from neglecting their own health. Capone escaped rival gangs, law enforcement, and assassination attempts, but he could not escape the consequences of ignoring his illness. In the end, the man who controlled an entire city could not control his own mind. And that was his true downfall.